Great, thank you. Welcome everyone to the Native Voices in STEM, which is a series that has been going on for many years, featuring researchers, professors, partners who are doing work in Indigenous communities. And the Native Voices in STEM seminar series is co-sponsored by the Indigenous Resilience Center at the University of Arizona, the Sloan Indigenous Graduate Partnership, the Water Resources Research Center, Native Youth Alliance, and the Office of Societal Impact. And my name is Carletta Chief, and I'm the director of the Resilience Center. I am Better Waterborn for Near the Water. So thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Don Hankins is a professor of geography and planning at California State University, Chico. He has a bachelor's of science in wildlife, fish and conservation, biology, and a PhD in geography from the University of California, Davis. His interest and expertise is in the area of pyrogeography, eco-hydrology, landscape, ecology, intervention ecology, conservation, environmental policy, and indigenous stewardship. We're really excited to have him here and share his work on cultural birding, indigenous stewardship, land conservation, indigenous land management. Dr. Don Hankins combines his academic and cultural interests through applied research of indigenous stewardship practices as keystone processes in aid and conservation management of resources. He is currently engaged in fire and water research involving indigenous communities in California and Australia. Dr. Hankins has been involved in various aspects of land management and conservation for a variety of organizations and agencies, including federal and tribal governments. And here at the University of Arizona, we have a land acknowledgement, and I would like to share that with you. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with 2 being home to the O'odham and Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign Native nations and Indigenous community education, offerings, partnerships, and community services. As a director of the Indigenous Resilience Center, and along with my team here in the room and online, we go beyond the land acknowledgement by having this Native Voices in STEM and partnering with Indigenous communities, Indigenous organizations and partners, and leading in indigenized programs funded by foundations and federal agencies. And through the Native Voices in STEM, we are able to provide experiences and training and educational opportunities to our colleagues, our students, and networks across the region. So we're excited to have our final Native Voices in STEM of the academic year and conclude it with Dr. Don Hankins. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the platform over and welcome everyone here in the room and online to Native Voices in STEM final seminar series of the spring semester 2024. Thank you, and
Idiwei Chin, was it Don Hankins? Thank you for that introduction, Carletta. I really appreciate that. Today I'm joining you from Chico, which is the ancestral homeland for Concal speaking people. Currently Machupta is the tribe here in Chico, and I'm at the campus where the historic village of Bahapki is located. And I appreciate being invited to share a little bit about my work with you today, things that have inspired me to support our Indigenous communities here in California and abroad. I'm going to slowly bring up my presentation here to share, which I've titled Eleltek Waali, and that's in our Plains Miwok language and Muko, as we say in our language here, and kind of sharing the ideas of what our responsibilities are within the landscape and how those responsibilities show through in the work that I do. In framing that and what Carletta had introduced me with my undergrad degree in wildlife fish and conservation biology, from a very early age, I had a strong interest in the outdoors that came from growing up on the coast, on south of San Francisco, and experiences that kind of brought me throughout Central California and what I'll call, our traditional homelands and our storyscape. And throughout those experiences, it took me into understanding and a motivation for conservation, seeing that many of our habitats for many species, became impacted by the changes that came about from colonization, urbanization, agricultural conversion, things like that. And I've been fortunate in my life to experience some of these unique species in the area where I grew up, and also more broadly as I've traveled in different areas and worked in different areas. On the slide here, you see the San Francisco garter snake, which is a species I grew up playing with as a kid in my own neighborhood, and it's one of the rarest species of snakes in the world. And I've been able to work with it, getting some fire to improve its habitat and things like that. Working with species like red-legged frogs and apple mottle falcons in the Southwest, particularly down in Texas on the Rio Grande Valley. And then, thinking about the connections to the ocean, always important to us as well. And broadly to me, like when I think about the role of conservation, not only for these species, but also what the role of that act of connection within the landscape is to also supporting and conserving our culture and practices as well. In my early career, I worked for the U.S. Forest Service and was up in an area in the high country of the Sierra Nevadas north of Yosemite. And during that time, I really started to think of kind of the stories of the old people, what was known of the way that the landscape had been taken care of, what had changed, and what needed to happen. And this is a photograph I took in 1995 in my early career at a place called Eagle Meadow, which is also north of Yosemite. And it's a landscape that I remember, going into seeing it and thinking, wow, it looks really different than what I understand from the stories of the old people, what that landscape would have looked like. And I remember one day coming back in to my supervisor, and she asked me, hey, what the forest look like today? Does it look good out there? Or, what was your impression? And I said, it looks terrible. It's not very well taken care of. And, that's something I think is really important because it frames the way, obviously, that I think about it, but the intergenerational way of understanding a place that's really important. And that is kind of something that kind of runs a theme in what I'll be talking about today. In our language, in Muko, we have obviously a lot of different things that are encoded in language. And I'll say that, the language is not a first language to me. I began learning it as a young adult from the last fluent speaker of our language. And at this point, I'm currently the only person using the language, at least to my knowledge, within our community. But I have that responsibility in terms of bearing the knowledge that it has and what I learn from it on a day-to-day basis. In our language, we have this word called Eleltek, and that's the unconjugated word for reading. And you might think, well, that's interesting. Like as native peoples, like most of us don't have written languages, at least until the recent centuries, right? But the concept of Eleltek is really not about reading. It's about having a sensory existence. And when I think about that sensory existence, it comes from sight, smell, sound, touch, taste, and what I'll even say is the sixth sense that we as Indigenous peoples understand which is that sense of spirit or intuition of life force that's so important. And, when we think about that in science, like there often maybe some questions about how that sense of spirit fits into what we do. But as Indigenous peoples, like there is a strong understanding of that, and is really important for how we interpret the work that we do, and read things. In the case of Eleltek, as I see it, and I'll refer to it as Eleltek, which is meaning like I'm reading. It's about how we perceive the landscape, what we see that the landscape reveals to us, what the other relations within the landscape reveal to us in that space. And when we understand the connections of these different things and the terms of place, they come together in a way that's very powerful to inform the way that not only what the past existed in a place, but what the future might be as well. And I'll give some examples of how this fits into Indigenous knowledge in our language, some of the terms that exist, and what we can learn from language. And I find that to be really foundational to the way that I perceive the world and see the world. And some examples of that include things like knowing what our traditional village names were, and are, and what those names imply about the places where they're at. And on the map on the right-hand side here, you see this one village called Chukumne. And Chukumne is a place that's named for a very endangered fish called the the Delta smelt, which is a small minnow that lives in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta region. And Chukumne is the place where historically, as a place of the minnow, is the place where you would expect it to be found at, as its kind of primary habitat. Off the map are other place names like Sukumne, which is like the place where the salamanders are at. And all of these places have a name for them that tell us about the things that are there or phenomena that occur in that place. And they're a reminder to us of like what that stewardship of those places sometimes is about. Also within our language is this encoding of environmental conditions, thinking about things like the wind, particularly like today, we've got a north wind blowing through the Sacramento Valley. And in our language, we call that lokoli. And lokoli is the term for like a wind that is agitating, that's maybe causes people to become crazy. And these winds are also our dangerous ones for fire weather. And on this calendar that I put up, you see the seasons, and we recognize 5 seasons in this Delta region: winter, spring. Our summer is divided into 2 different parts, and then the fall. And there are 2 times of the year typically when that wind will pick up, and they're usually the times when our big fires happen. And so there's really strong understanding that has to take place around that. So our knowledge is really important to framing, that understanding of taking care of place and the phenomenon that occur in those areas. When we look at landscapes and we look at the places that we steward, when in this idea of Eleltek, that I'm always looking for the indicators, the indicators that validate the need for something to take place, or maybe approval condition of the work that has taken place. For me personally, that idea and how it relates to kind of my adult life work around fire really originates with the condor. And the California condor in our story is central to our creation. And in my early career, I got to work in Southern California with the condors. And it was during that time that I started to think about why the condors were going extinct. Why is it that they're on decline, and why are they not doing well? And the reason that I could see was that the landscape wasn't being taken care of. And at the time where I was working at, we were in sacred Chumash country, where their stories originate. And that's where we were releasing these condors at. And I looked at the landscape and I could see, well, there's not places for them to forage. There's not places for their food to be. And so we need to do something different. And that's where I started on the trajectory of working to bring fire back into the landscape, working with community. But around us, and regardless of whatever ecosystems we're working in, like there's those reminders of our traditional stories and responsibilities to do things within the the aquatic realm and the insect and plant communities and things like that, that ultimately validate the work that we do and the need to do that work within place. And I'll talk about fire. So Eleltek Wuge means reading for fire. And when we think about Indigenous fire, there's a lot of different reasons why Indigenous peoples use fire. I know earlier in these talks, you learned from Denise Martinez's work. And so I don't have to go into too much discussion of that for those of you who are present for her presentation. But the the ideas of Indigenous fire are quite different than, say, wildfire or prescribed burning, and in which case, in prescribed burning, you might be burning just to create blackened areas to protect around homes, or you might be doing wildlife habitat improvement. But in the context of Indigenous stewardship, it's based on our traditional laws, our understandings of place, the seasonalities of those things. Also what the objectives are. We think about, connection back for hunting, fishing, gathering of plant materials, those kinds of things. And then also just based on our traditional rights of being able to burn as Indigenous peoples, as our stories and responsibilities have been passed down by generations. In reading the landscape and thinking about this idea of how I read, I drew this sketch to help people to understand the idea. We think about knowing when and what to burn, where the fire will go and where it's going to go out without having to put in a fire break around it. And we know what those outcomes are going to be. So if we're burning in a meadow and that meadow is the only receptive fuel, so within that ecotone, there might be areas that aren't going to carry the fire in the grass itself. Maybe it's too wet, maybe it's in a different soil condition. The adjacent vegetation communities might also keep it in check with high fuel moistures and things like that. This is a really important concept in terms of understanding it when we read the landscape for fire, because as we understand fire behavior and we start to apply fire as Indigenous peoples, we have to know what the outcomes are going to be, including where that fire is going to go when we set it. If we set fire and we don't understand it, then we become part of the problem in creating wildfires and undesirable outcomes. And this idea really kind of surfaced to me at the first time at a landscape scale in 2003 when I visited the Northern Territory of Australia. And this is a photograph from the Ubir River floodplain in Kakadu National Park. And Kakadu National Park is a co-managed park, and it's a World Heritage Site. And I'm standing up on a rock escarpment that actually has paintings on the rock art sites below me. And this is a site that's been occupied for, since time immemorial, and a lot of Indigenous Australians will talk about, 50 to 60,000 years of continued existence in this place. And this is all Indigenous stewardship that we're seeing in this image, and different times of fire. The only vegetation community in this that doesn't have fire in it is that monsoon forest. It's fire sensitive, and it's black-lined around with fire, protected by early season burning. And then the rest of the landscape is also on fire. And when I saw this for the first time, it was like, wow, like I can really see how the landscape works together and how the synergy of fire in these places comes in different times and seasons and scales, right? And this has been something that I always come back to as I travel the landscape, seeing different areas of the world, is that this ability to read the landscape for fire comes from this initial gift that came from being in Kakadu. I'll take you out to the Western Desert of Australia among the Mardu people and thinking about other concepts that fit into this understanding of Eleltek. And here we're looking at spinifex vegetation, and Mardu people burn on a routine basis for hunting and traditional livelihoods. And we see the terminology here spanning from Nyurnma to Waruwaru, Mangu, Nyukara, and Kunarka. And these are the terms that Mardu used to describe fire seral states within this landscape. And that last word, Kunarka, refers to when it needs to be burned because it's not healthy. It looks terrible. Specifically, the word has a root word for excrement in it, kuna. And in our language in Miwok, like that same word is used to describe excrement. And when we think about like the reasons why people want to burn, it's an aesthetic that is needed to be maintained within the landscape. And so I'll go through some examples of different places where I've been able to work with putting fire back in for conservation purposes, with this idea of trying to restore balance and health. One of those places, keeping to the Australian examples for a moment, is the Kanjanachi Indigenous Protected Area in the northeast of Australia in the Cape York Peninsula. I was invited over in 2010 to participate in revitalizing fire traditions in this place that had just recently been returned back to the Indigenous Kanjanachi people. And in the elapsed time, I've started a long-term research project with the community there and have responsibilities within community for taking care of this place that is part of the wet tropics. And it's a biodiversity hotspot. But the removal of indigenous people about 85 years or so ago, because of mining emissions, led to a series of wildfires that ultimately started ravaging the landscape and causing damage to the biodiversity. So in 2008, when Kanjanachi was formed as an indigenous protected area, they identified fire, and particularly their fire, as being an important priority. But also how that connects to maintaining biodiversity and bringing biodiversity back into the landscape, and a certain aesthetic to the landscape that biodiversity would be found in. And I'm pleased to say that, when we're able to steward the landscape with the right kinds of fires, and this is a mix of wildfires happening in this place and indigenous fire happening in the same place, we finally can restore back the structures that support that biodiversity. And we see this open stringy bark woodland here that has a nice mix of grasses and a huge diversity of species in the understory. In terms of vegetation, the research that I have going on out here identifies about 200 different species of plants. And I'm not tracking the animals here, but attracted to those plants are the animals. And one of the key species that's here for Kanjanachi people is the palm cockatoo. And at the time when we started burning in 2010 with this project, there were no palm cockatoos nesting at Kanjanachi. And at the time when I took this photo in 2015, there were 4 pairs that were living at Kanjanachi. And that's all in relationship to restoring the right kind of fire as a keystone cultural species within this place. My dissertation research focused on putting fire back into riparian areas. And this came from working within community. As a weaver myself, I knew that the quality of materials that we use for weaving our coiled baskets and open work baskets was, it needed fire, that we needed to be able to steward with fire to make sure that we didn't have stem boring insects within the sticks that would make those baskets weak. And so, trying to find a space to be able to burn kind of was something that was unheard of. For generations, people hadn't been able to apply fire within our communities. And I worked with people from about 14 different tribes from across the state of California, from northwestern California all the way down to San Diego County, spanning the state, and in developing this project. And we had some space that was offered up for doing some burns. And initially we were able to do some small burns that were about 6 acres in size, which was really foundational in the sense that no indigenous peoples in the state had been able to apply fire in riparian zones to our knowledge over the previous century. And we were able to bring fire back in with the intent of being able to study it and share it, because these riparian areas, one, there are so many rare species that are found in them, and then there's so many environmental regulations that limit the ability to actually apply fire. And this was a priority for me because, one, in the state of California, like, our riparian areas represent less than 2% of historically what they existed at. So we've got these really rare ecosystems that are vulnerable because there's such high productivity within the vegetation communities and the risk to biodiversity decline. And so some of these areas have been susceptible to wildfires. We've lost many acres of valley oak and cottonwood and other native species habitats because of these types of fires. And it's not that they won't come back, but it's that temporal impact that happens in place that's a problem. So being able to put cultural fire back into these places, over that time period from about 2002 into the present, we've really seen some benefits to that, not only for our native species. We find that those species benefit from the timings of when we burn, mostly in the fall, as we're going into winter, as things are going into rest. It's a really good time for burning in these systems, but they can burn pretty much at any time of the year, depending on what the objectives are. And so when we look at like willows, like they'll come back even in the summertime in the growing season and make really nice sticks for weaving with. But if we're thinking about the whole picture, like burning in those cooler months and the dormant months are much better for those outcomes. Similarly, if we think about our oak woodlands, in California, we're acorn eaters. And so when we think about the connections of stewarding our oak woodlands and similarly to our riparian areas, like our oak woodlands are also pretty heavily impacted, particularly the valley oak, the blue oak communities here in California are some of the ones that are most heavily impacted by agricultural conversion and also just development, within these areas. And so being able to steward these oak woodlands again, for biodiversity, thinking about the health of acorn crops as kind of the foundation for why to burn, but then also thinking about the diversity of different plant and animals and, different organisms that we find there as part of our relational responsibilities is really important. And again, if we're burning at the right times, we're able to sustain those things. And if we're burning at the wrong times, we see those things begin to decline. By reference, because I mentioned how many species we have in the Cape York Peninsula, it'd be about 200 species on my research plots. Here in California, in the oak woodlands and riparian areas, they range from about 60 to about 100 species in these plots, depending on where we're at. And a lot of that at this point in time is non-native species. Nope. I think my audio might have cut out. So if somebody comes up and tells me my audio cut out, let me know. Otherwise, I keep talking. But thinking about like the idea of reading the landscape, our landscapes are quite diverse. We've got a lot of different factors that are part of them that like the interaction of different vegetation communities and things like that. And in terms of reading the landscape, this sketch that I put over the top of a photograph shows, the way that I read a landscape when I'm helping to bring fire into certain places. In this case, it's our campus's ecological reserves and trying to vision what a burn in this landscape looks like, where we've got a chaparral community and a black oak woodland, and how we would put fire in to protect and create the conservation values, but also the cultural outcomes that we're looking for in these places. This also gets me to thinking about the role of what's happened within our landscapes because of the absence of fire. And this is an example again from our Big Chico Creek Ecological Reserve, where over the last century there hasn't been enough fire within the landscape in a place where traditionally Mechoopda Concal folks burned fairly frequently to maintain valley oak woodlands. And in the center of this slide, where I'm putting the cursor now, you can see some valley oak trees. And these valley oak trees are trees that evolved in a landscape with a fairly frequent fire return interval, meaning every 2 to maybe 10 years at the longest. And in the absence of fire, these valley oak trees have become encroached upon by canyon live oak trees, which are these darker trees here on the slide. And these are fire sensitive species. And so when we remove fire from the landscape, other species come in and change the dynamics of the landscape. And so we see a difference in the fire behavior. We see a difference in what the outcomes of those fires might be because of that departure from fire. One of the other things in terms of reading fire within the landscape and as it relates to oaks is that many of our oak woodland communities, as I said, are vulnerable because of their isolation, but they also become vulnerable because of the fires that they are seeing now, and mostly, from other human-caused factors. Thinking about power lines and people dragging chains along roadways and things like that. And this is an area just south of the town of Oroville here in California, where two fires have happened in subsequent years, in 2014 and in 2018 timeframes. We see like the post-fire conditions within this landscape that once had valley oak, blue oak, and interior live oak, all of which are fire tolerant species. But what I'm pointing out here is that because of the effects and combined effects of like fire severity and drought, that we've basically lost the forest in this landscape that once was mostly vegetated as woodland. And so these are the kinds of risks that exist within the state, where we're not applying fires, and what happens if we aren't doing that stewardship. I'd like to transition now to talk a little bit more about the work that I've been doing in the space of water. And I call this Eleltek keek, and keek is our word for water, and reading that space for the water. Interestingly, like what I'll highlight are some current restoration projects that I'm engaged with in the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta. And the San Joaquin Delta region is an area that a lot of people would say historically was probably dominated by tule marshes that, based on early settler accounts, it was like they said it was flooded and like mostly just tules. However, from a cultural perspective, we know that it was quite different, that there were forests, there were villages, there were grasslands, there was a huge diversity of things that were there. And in thinking about one, just showing the existence of people within place is really important. That we often get erased from the conversations of what the ecology of the landscape is. And the geographer C. Hart Merriam in the early 1900s traveled through our communities and photographed people and narrated kind of the ethnography of place and the ecology of place. And in the Delta, he found on this one island that he just called it Nuyup Island, these two women, and I have no idea who these women are. They're not known within our community, but they're from the Delta. And they show that where this is at, that people were living in a place that that early settlers would have said was not inhabitable, that it was just wetlands. And so like that photographic evidence is something I think is really important in terms of just showing connection to place, and also then thinking about, well, if they were living in this place, what were the things that they needed to survive, and how can we look to the landscape conditions today to revitalize that? And in this sense, what I want to illustrate is like sorry, I got to pop up the chat there because I thought somebody was telling me something. When we think about the landscape conditions, and this is near where that photograph of the two women on New York Island were at, we think about like the opportunities of restoring, in a landscape that's been heavily impacted by draining of the wetlands, by leveling the forests and clearing the forests, and then turning it into farmland, that now is deeply impacted by subsidence in some areas. Some of the islands now within the Delta are well below 40 feet below sea level. And these were all at sea level or above in the pre-settlement time period. So how do we start to look for the clues of what historically was there? I mean, we know from our stories, the vegetation communities that would have supported villages in place, and the species that exist within story, that we can piece together. But one of those ways of validating the landscape and the physical landscape is by looking at the soils. And so we're looking at a map here of the polygons of the soils in the Delta in this one island called Bolden Island. And when we look through this data, we can look to see what the historic vegetation found in the soil profiles are. What are the remnant pieces of vegetation that are there as indicators of what potentially could have been supported in these places. And so I use that as one way of looking at the past history of the landscape in terms of like what the potential future might be as well. And so that's an approach that we're using in this one project to create a space of understanding like what restoring this island might look like. Um, and associated with that understanding of the vegetation community is also then understanding like how did water interact within this landscape? And using historical imagery, I've been able to piece together where old sloughs were once located. And on this map, you can kind of see some of those starting to emerge with these little white line threads that go through this piece of land. And the imagery provides a lot of different indicators of what that historic landscape features might have been, where those sloughs were perhaps located as part of like the tidal slough systems within this area. Um, and it's important to utilize as many of these images that you can possibly get. Fortunately for this location, we have images that go back to 1939. And so we have a good detail of different conditions on the island that we can start to piece together to understand where like these old sloughs were located and where water pools up and things like that. In I think it was early 2021, I began working on this restoration project with Metropolitan Water District in California, and they're one of the big water purveyors within the state. And I would have never imagined that I would have worked with them, but they own these islands. They own about 20,000 acres of land within the Delta, and this island, Bolden Island, is about 6,000 acres. And they came to me and said, "Hey, we want to build a restoration plan around the island and incorporate ecological knowledge." So drawing on those things that I've talked about, the soils and the historic imagery, like this is an initial map of what the land looked like. The vast area of it would have mostly been like a sedge grassland area, but there were areas of riparian forest as well mixed in with these sloughs. And the restoration plan kind of has incorporated it amongst other things to look like this, where we have, by 2070, that inclusion of areas that have the wetlands and the forested areas as well. The work that we did in the ecocultural space really was pivotal in integrating in all the different values from water quality to habitat to recreational values and all those sorts of things that they approached me again and said, "Hey, we want to take on the next island. We want to look at web tract, which has significance to it as well." And so we're in the process of building this one out right now. But within it, there's a responsibility of maintaining some agricultural lands, as we see in the blue polygons on this map, and the rest of it's going to be restored to wetland transitional areas, including some sand dune areas. And what I'll say is that, like, when we think about the aspects of polluticulture and wetland farming for rice, um, rice is not a native plant in this region. And I think about like the opportunities of reintroducing traditional foods to our communities and supporting those kind of diverse crops and things like that within this landscape. There's other things that we could be growing, and an example of that is here in this picture with tule potato and the cattails and other wetland plants that are part of this landscape as the native plants for this landscape that we could also be incorporating. And so these are things that are now part of the discussion in terms of like what the future of that landscape might look like. I do want to highlight, environmental change. Obviously, we've had a lot of changes happen because of the conversion to agriculture within the Delta region. But even the natural islands themselves have been impacted by other activities like recreation, wave action, sea level rise, which is constant in this area, and I've seen it over my lifetime even. But in this case, I'm highlighting one of the islands. It's just south of Webb Tract, and we're seeing that the island is diminishing in size because of sea level rise. Um, in kind of bringing things a little bit closer to close, I want to just talk a little bit about the opportunities around using this idea of Eleltek in conservation as a whole. We know that, there's a connection between our story spaces and where our cultural connections to landscapes connect with biodiversity. And our storyscapes are some of the places that are the origins of where some of these species are found at. For instance, when I talk about where condor is found at within our story, like there's so many things that are associated with it that are there. And not only is it that they're often our story places, but they're the story places of the surrounding tribal peoples as well. And so these areas I call like ecocultural diversity hotspots, and those ecocultural diversity hotspots provide an opportunity for us to think about new ways of visioning and centering Indigenous ways of knowing and reading the landscape in conservation and that planning and effort to be successful in that space. And in thinking about that idea of conserving the storyscapes, I go back one to some of my work that I've done in the water space around like vernal pool conservation and where our traditional stewardship practices would help to protect those rare ecosystems as well and the species associated with them. But then also, going back to even my grad school days of thinking about the connections of culture and place and existing conserved lands. On the right, you see a map that I did back in 2002 that shows the connections of where if we buffered out around historic village sites, and these are not all of them, but if we buffered them out to think about where, the grizzly bear range would have been, what a grizzly bear would need to survive, and buffer between those and the existing conserved areas, we can find gaps of where we need to be focusing for species that have great land area needs and dispersal needs and things like that, while also protecting our ecocultural values. And so that then brings me to thinking about, the opportunities around restoration and stewardship, being able to, reclaim places, to repopulate places that need to be healed. In this case, we're looking at a formerly operated mine site, and both images actually were sand and gravel operations. On the left-hand side, the tending and gathering garden at the Cache Creek Nature Preserve, which is not within our ancestral territories, but a place that I helped to bring not only the plantings back to, but also fire. And this was one of the sites that Denise Martinez referenced in the tending the fire programs that they do with their programs at Davis. So this was what it looked like before they were even able to put fire there. It was just bare dirt practically. And so we need to be able to restore and reclaim these places, and then we need to be able to steward them. With that, I just want to say, and kind of wrapping this up, is the opportunities that are there around policy work, and where I'm at right now in developing this, the work around fire and water, is that we're also now able to leverage that around the framing of policy. And so some examples of that include thinking of reports like the Good Fire reports that we've written with the Karuk tribe to leverage the need for fire within the landscape. Recently, the state of California awarded the Pathways to 30 by 30 tribal grants, and there are many places that have benefited because of the work that we've done in showing the connections between conservation and the value of that to the state. And then more recently at the federal level, the Mature and Old Growth Forest Report, which is this Braiding Indigenous and Western Knowledge Report, talks about the protection of our old growth forest. And these are the places where Indigenous knowledge is being brought in and shared around that. And so in one of those spaces that we're trying to further that in the fire front is an effort called the Stewardship Project, which is focused on the Western U.S., but key elements of it include recognizing the tribal right to steward, developing workforce capacity and development, realigning regulatory frameworks, particularly thinking about the National Environmental Policy Act and the Endangered Species Act, which were written in a time when, one, the role of fire wasn't recognized, but also the role of Indigenous stewardship wasn't recognized within our national policies. And we're making good headway with these ideas within our federal policymakers. And included in that is this idea of strategic fire zones, places that on this map that you see, and we just found out yesterday that this has been accepted to the Journal of Fire Ecology, that this idea of places where we can actually have spaces where fire can be used that aren't necessarily going to be places that are impacting our wildland urban interface communities, let's say, but also places where Indigenous stewardship can be more effectively brought in as a process within these landscapes. And so in thinking of those connections, you know, fire obviously plays a big role in the work that I do, but I also see the connections to water. You know, we have choices to make in the way that we apply it within our landscape. You know, either we remain vulnerable to wildfires and the feedbacks that those have, but Indigenous fire brings us so much more in terms of healing of our community, the greenhouse gas emission reductions, and also biodiversity conservation. Hopefully this paper that this is referencing and the concept of Eleltek will be out within the next month within the Proceeding National Academy of Sciences. So I'll share that with you all once that's available. In closing, what I'd just like to say is that, you know, at this point in my career, I also think seeing and leveraging the support for younger people to come in and learn is a huge part of it. Obviously, you know, as a person at an academic institution, like teaching has always been something that I've been passionate about, but I'm even more passionate about being able to make sure that we've got more Native students in the learning space. This past December here at CSU Chico, we brought fire back onto our campus proper, and right in the middle of downtown Chico, we lit deer grass off. And this was in partnership with the local tribe, Machupta. The person that we had kind of lighting the fires with my supervision is a former student from Chico State who is a Machupta tribal member. He's the first person to light fire on campus at this old village site, probably in the last 150 years. We were able to bring fire back in. And we're also teaching other Native students, and that's what we're looking at in this photograph, or, you know, a crowd of Native students standing and learning and getting to participate in this burn. And it's that kind of inspiration I think is really important to make those connections so that we can not only heal the land, but also heal ourselves and our communities. With that, I'll bring it to a close. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Don Hankins. We appreciate your talk. And now we'd like to take a little bit of time to do a Q&A. So if anybody has any questions online, or if you'd like to ask them in the chat, that would be great. If you just want to, you know, use your little emoji to raise your hand, so that way we can get your questions answered.
I have a question. About that. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation on cultural burning, Dr. Hankins. This is such an important and emerging topic that brings together climate change, stewardship, and Indigenous peoples together. So I commend you for your leadership on this, because as we enter into the question of Indigenous involvement in climate change and land management, my question kind of is a cross of the two in terms of health impacts. So with these cultural burnings, are there considerations or discussion or action around impacts to health, like from burning? Because as a side effect of any kind of burning, and with vulnerable populations such as children and elders, air pollution can be of huge concern to them. So are there any like differences in when you talk about cultural burning and when you think about health impacts resulting from air pollution? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question, and certainly the air quality aspect of it is something that comes up a lot in the space of fire. You know, one thing that we know, and this also kind of comes back to that that schematic that I put up from the proceedings paper that's forthcoming. The you know, the difference between wildfire smoke and prescribed fire or cultural fire smoke is quite different. You know, when we're doing cultural burning specifically. You know, we actually see smoke culturally as an important part of the landscape. It's part of, you know, the medicine, right? We know that we use it in ceremony, you know, as a way not only of taking care of our own selves, but also taking care of the landscape. You know, so when I think about the health of the oaks that I talked about, You know, a lot of times we're trying to create a condition that not only burns the understory of the forest to clean up the litter and reduce the amount of pests that are there, but that pest aspect of it also comes from like what's suspended in the air, right? So like we've got weevils and things like that that infest the acorns. And when we can burn and have an inversion that sets that smoke down in the canopy of the trees for a period of time, it minimizes the amount of pests in the tree, so it improves the quality of the acorn. But there also is that human health aspect of it. The point that I would say around the human health side of it is that, you know, when we think about applying cultural fire, you know, the amount of fire that we're putting on the landscape is never going to be to the scale of a wildfire. We're not going to burn off 500,000 acres in a day, or, you know, anything to that effect. Like our burns are usually a lot smaller. In fact, the largest indigenous fires that I saw in my work in Australia, which is where we see a lot more burning taking place, was probably maybe a few thousand acres in size. You know, so we think about the emissions of fires at that scale versus a large wildfire. One, the intensity that they're burning at is different, and two, the amount of emissions that they're producing is different. And so we've got a lot of data that's emerging around that. In fact, there was a National Academy of Science report on greenhouse gas emissions that came out recently that's focused on this, and not on the human health side of it, but you can draw the correlations. The take-home messages from that report are basically that we need to be increasing the amount of burning we're doing, and we need to find ways of retaining moisture within the landscape. Indigenous fire creates that. Indigenous fire creates the biochar within the landscape that helps to retain the moisture within the landscape. You know, so there's a lot of different aspects of it. But yeah, the human health side of it, for sure is definitely on the radar. We need to be collecting more data in terms of even like what the exposure is to us who burn more regularly. But there is data that shows that Indigenous people engaging in traditional activities of stewardship have healthier lifestyles. Rates of diabetes decrease, rates of cancers are known to decrease. This is at least based off of research that was done in Australia. So yeah, I don't know. There's a lot more I could say on it, but I'll leave space for some other questions.
Thank you for that, Don Hankins. We do have one question in the chat. Nico Sanchez, thank you, Nico. He is saying, thank you so much for your talk, Dr. Hankins. Can you speak to the effect that the groundwater in the Central Valley and its implication on your work?
Yeah, so in terms of the groundwater aspects, I'm wondering, Nico, if you're thinking in terms of like the subsidence aspects, or are you thinking about like how we get water back into the aquifers? Both, okay. Yeah, so for those of you who aren't familiar, and I mentioned the subsidence issues in the Delta region, you know, that's not necessarily related to groundwater pumping. It's because the islands and the land itself, which has deep organic soils, has been like quarantined off with the levees that were created, and then the drying of the land has oxidized the organic soils so that they've compressed over time. What we've learned there is that we need to resaturate those places. By resaturating them, they start to recover and support the landscape. And I would say that, you know, in terms of subsidence reversal in a lot of the areas of the Central Valley, there are definitely places where, you know, we've had irreversible damage because of the subsidence that's occurred. But we also know that we need to be stewarding to get more water back in the landscape. I see fire having a key role in that as well. You know, as we think about areas that have like cultural burning on them, they're going to have greater infiltration. They're going to have greater moisture holding capabilities because of, like, as I mentioned earlier, like biochar within the landscape. And so those kinds of materials are going to help to allow for that infiltration rate to increase. And so that's an important part in terms of that subsidence reversal. In other cases, like I would say, like in those areas where we haven't been able to, and this is me just talking off the top of my head because I don't do the research on this, but I see the opportunity around it, is that where we have had like damage because of overuse of groundwater and irreversible subsidence, maybe we need to be looking at those as surface water storage. And I give an example of this that's been on my mind for a long while. Tulare Lake in the San Joaquin Valley is a great example. This past year, it flooded up because of the amount of rains that we had and snow melt. And it's an area that's in a sinking area of the valley, like some areas that are probably 75 feet deeper than what they historically were. And, I see that as like, okay, we've now increased the potential volume of Tulare Lake as a resource, so-called resource for water storage that isn't traditionally utilized. And I will say that, like, in connection to Tulare Lake, years back, when I worked at Tuolumne Rancheria, we actually were making comments on some of the state's water plans, and we had suggested to them with a letter that I had written for the tribe that they ought to be looking at Tulare Lake and rewetting Tulare Lake as a future scenario rather than building new reservoirs within the state. So because of improper water management within the state, they now have a deeper water potential storage area than historically was there. So I don't know, just ideas on that. I don't know if that answers what you're thinking about there, Nico.
Thank you, Nico. And we have one time for one more question. Gwen Woods in the chat says, thank you so much for a very informative presentation. I was wondering if and how climate change has changed the abilities of Indigenous people to read landscapes for fire.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would just say that, when we're in tune with the landscape and we're looking for the indicators, they're always present. In some years they're going to tell us that it's too wet to burn because we've got too much rainfall. This past season is an example where in the area where I live in the forest, like, we weren't able to burn until fairly recently because it was too hot and dry. And then the rain just came in real heavy and it was really difficult to get any burning done. But then in the last couple of weeks, I look for some of the indicators. I'm waiting for some of the birds to arrive, and I'm looking for, some of the bees. And, here are the times when we can start to do some burning. And so, if you're paying attention to the landscape, and that's the whole idea of why I talk about reading the landscape, is when you're familiar with those indicators in your local landscape, when and how you have the opportunities to bring fire in. So while the seasons may be changing and they may be shorter time periods of when we can burn, I don't think there's ever an opportunity where we can't use it, particularly if we're paying attention to those landscapes.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Hankins. And that about wraps up our time. I think we have 2 minutes left to spare. If anybody else has anything, or if you have any further closing remarks for the group here.
I just want to say thank you for the opportunity. I'm glad to be able to share this. Unfortunately, it's hard to see the whole audience, so I appreciate that, and I hope my audio was working okay. I kept getting these messages that my audio was disconnecting, and I was like, I hope they can hear me. So, but I appreciate it, and look forward to continued communications with folks and with IRES and other faculty and students and whatnot down at Arizona.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. And our team has put some information in the chat. Please be on the lookout for the fall 2024 Native Voices in STEM lineup, and give us a follow on our newsletter. Dr. Chief has provided the link in the chat, and Torin has also put some information for our next program happening this Thursday out at the Bosco Yaqui Tribal Annex. So please feel free to join us. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah. Hey, one last thing, while it's on my mind, if there's folks here from California tribes, I will probably be leading the 5th climate assessment report for the state. And so if folks have things that they want to add to that or communicate with me about on that, I'll just put that plug out there.
Thank you.